So the real interest rate risk, and this is sort of the baseline risk, the real interest rate risk is essentially just the time value of money risk, okay? This is the fact that I know that my money is not going to be worth the same in the future just because I don't have access to it, right? So if I loan you money for a year, and let's say, you borrow money from your parents, they're not going to charge you an interest rate, but they still have a cost, right? And that cost is that they don't have access to that money for a year, right? So even if you think that someone is completely safe, that there's zero chance that you wouldn't get your loan returned, the fact that you don't have access to your money for a year is a significant cost to you. And that is what the real interest rate would be, right? So the real interest rate is just essentially the rate that is charged because you don't have access to your money, okay? Now, it also comes with some terminology that is used pretty often, so it's something that we want to talk about, okay? The real interest rate, right, the baseline rate, so if we said that something is the real interest rate, this is the rate of return that's been adjusted for inflation. So this is the rate of return that we could compare throughout time, because it would be, we would already have removed the effect of inflation from it, okay? So this is the rate that you would charge simply so that you would retain your purchasing power, and it's just for not having access to your money, okay? The nominal rate, right? So real rate is adjusted for inflation. The nominal rate is just the actual rate that is charged. So it is prior to removing the effect of inflation. The nominal rate is the rate that you would see on the contract, okay? So when real rates are high, everything else tends to be high because, as you can see in the term structure, the real rate is the baseline. This is what we start with, okay? Because we're not thinking about risk here. We're just thinking about not being able to use my money. What would I charge somebody for that? That's the baseline. Everything else is going to be a premium on top of the real rate, including here, see, an inflation premium that I would charge because inflation makes my value, the value of my cash worth less. And then ultimately, whatever I would arrive at after all of the risks, see that top line is the nominal rate. Okay, so the nominal rate still has inflation in it. The real rate has been adjusted for inflation. Now, these two terms are important enough when we're talking about it that it is necessary for us to have some way to convert real rates into nominal rates, and particularly important for us to be able to convert nominal rates into real rates. And usually this is just for comparison. Okay, so if you hear, for instance, that somebody got charged a rate of 20% in the 1980s to get a house loan, and that's actually true, although it wasn't that bad. It was like 12, 15% house loans in the 80s, and now rates are 2% right now. We want to be able to compare those, but what we have to be aware of is that there is an inflation premium built into both of those things, and we want to be able to compare them. We have to remove the effect of inflation. Okay, so one of the ways that we can do that is through the use of what's called the Fisher formula or the Fisher effect. And it is just a very simple formula that says that there's a relationship between the real rate, the nominal rate, and the inflation rate that is defined by this formula up top. So that 1 plus the nominal rate is equal to 1 plus the real rate times 1 plus the inflation rate. Okay? And so that means that if we require 10% real return, but we expect inflation to be 8%, what is the rate that we should charge? What's the nominal rate? And what you have to think about here, why this is so important, is that if I would charge someone 10% just to have use of my money, but inflation is, say, 10% over the same time period, then ultimately when somebody paid me back, I would not have made any additional return. Right? The effect of inflation would have reduced the value of my dollar enough that the interest rate that I charged them had no effect. So I would effectively have charged them nothing to keep my money for a year. So I have to increase the rate that I charge them to account for inflation. And I do that using this Fisher effect. I multiply 1 plus the real rate times 1 plus the expected inflation rate, and then I subtract 1 to get the rate that I should charge, the nominal rate, and I should charge them 18.8% to account for inflation. Right? Now I can approximate the Fisher effect, and this is a pretty good approximation just by adding the two rates. So just add 10% plus 8%, you get 18. It's pretty close. It's much closer when the rates are smaller, this approximation. So the Fisher approximation is actually a really good, just sort of back of the envelope way to remove the effect of inflation from the nominal rate and be able to compare real rates across time. Okay, the next risk is interest rate risk, and we've already talked about interest rate risk. This is the risk that the market rate changes, and I showed you that graph. The risk that the market rate changes, and as the market rate changes, the value of my bond changes. And the risk, of course, is that the market rate moves against me and the value of my bond decreases. Okay? So the interest rates risk is much greater between maturity. And as the maturity increases, the interest rate rates increases even larger. And we can see that both in the term structure, that the interest rate risk premium gets significantly larger over time. But we can also see it in the example, the graph that we looked at, looking at the prices of a 30-year bond and a 1-year bond as the market interest rate changes. Okay. So interest rate risk is a huge risk. It's something that we got to be prepared for, and so it's going to be a significant premium on any loan that we make. It is a premium that we charge to account for the fact that we bear interest rate risk. Okay, inflation risk, again, we've talked about it, but inflation eats at the value of my money. So if somebody is going to pay me back $1,000 in 20 years, I have to charge them something so that whatever I receive back from them in 20 years buys the exact same amount that $1,000 does today. Right? So when we think about inflation, to me, I always think about the stories that my grandma would tell me about. Oh, I used to go and buy a hamburger at McDonald's for a nickel. Right? So what that means is that she paid a nickel what I have to pay $5 for. And so that's inflation at work. The inflation is prices of goods creeping up so that the value of my dollar slowly decreases, right? I used to be able to buy 20 hamburgers for $1, and now I can only buy 1/5 of a hamburger for $1. And because of that inflation, because of the way that devaluation works, when I make someone a loan, I have to charge them a little bit extra interest so that I get a little bit extra money, and just enough, at the very minimum, just enough to counteract inflation. Just enough so that when they pay me back the amount of money that buys the same amount of goods today as it did when I loaned it to them, right? So if I loan you $1,000 now, well, $1,000 buys a lot now, right? Buys a nice computer. What I want to make sure is that when you pay me back, that whatever you pay me back still buys me a nice computer. Whether that's $1,000 or whether that's $2,000, it's going to depend on how long of a time period we go through, right? Now, inflation in the US is typically pretty low, 2 or 3% a year. So the inflation risk premium is also typically pretty low. We add 2% to the interest rate that we charge you just so that what's called the inflation premium, I add 2% just so that I counteract the effect of inflation.